Welcome to this week's episode of the A-Team Show!
Yay.
Welcome to this week's episode of the A-Team Show. This week we're focusing on wrestling of the 1980s. We're going to start off this week with some sad news. The wrestling world, and indeed the fans, we lost the other half of one of the greatest tag teams ever to come out of the world of professional wrestling. Joe Laurinaitis, better known as Animal, of Legion of Doom. Now he's up there with his tag team partner Hulk. Obviously they're both riding their motorbikes with spiked shoulder pads. So from all of us at the 80s team, we just want to send our condolences to the family of the Laurinaitis, and Animal, we will see you down the road. So what we're going to do now is have our own 10 bell salute to Animal, and obviously we can kick the show off after that. Welcome to this part of the show. I'll be showing you and telling you some of the wrestling promotions of the 1980s. And at no time will you see I'm biased towards any wrestling promotion. Anyway, let's start off. Obviously, back in the 80s, we had Georgia Championship Wrestling. We had Jim Crockett Promotions, which went on to be WCW. Then we had the AWA, the NWA, then we had the UWF. As you can see, these are some of the logos. You've got the AWA, the NWA, but then there's one we probably all forgot, and it was a promotion, even though it was on TV, they were still wrestlers, and I'm talking about Glow. The Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. That's right, an all-female promotion. What gets me is, I remember when I was young and I used to watch it. It was on cable TV. It was brilliant. If we're talking about any wrestling promotion, we have to talk about Stampede Wrestling. It was managed and run by Stu Hart and the legendary Hart family. When we know, obviously, you can't talk wrestling in the 80s without talking about the Hart family, especially the Dungeon. Obviously, Stampede trained a lot of wrestlers, and I mean a lot of the good wrestlers, but also they trained them, they even produced some of the best wrestlers. Some of them went on to the, I'm unbiased, the WWF at the time. Stampede Wrestling produced, obviously, the Hart Foundation, the British Bulldogs, you know, Dynamite Kid, Davey Boy Smith. But what some of you probably didn't know, Davey Boy Smith and Dynamite Kid started their careers over here in England when they wrestled for the World of Sport. All you remember the World of Sport? You know, the great British wrestlers, Big Daddy, Giant A-Stacks, Mick McManus. Obviously, you had a very young British Bulldog, you had a young Dynamite Kid, but then when they left England, they went over to Canada, obviously they joined up with Stu Hart for Stampede Wrestling. Here we have just a couple of photos to remind you of the Hart Foundation. Ta-da! Then we have the British Bulldogs, Davey Boy Smith and the Dynamite Kid. Unfortunately, the Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy, they're not with us anymore. But obviously they're in the squared circle in the sky. They can always, well, obviously they're tag team and they'd face the Road Warriors. Who wouldn't? But obviously, I'm not biased, but if we're talking about wrestling in the 1980s, we need to talk about the WWF. That's right, that little promotion, owned, operated by Vince McMahon Jr. That's right, in my opinion only, so it's my opinion that matters. To me, Vince McMahon is God. I don't care, he means the world to me. But then you've got the WWF in the 80s, and if it wasn't for Vince McMahon and the WWF, and obviously the wonderful, the brilliant, the fantastic, the splendid, he can't do no wrong, Hulk Hogan, you wouldn't have had the first ever pay-per-view shown on closed circuit TV, the name of WrestleMania. That's right, WrestleMania 1. It was highlighted by Hulk Hogan and the A-Team's Mr. T when they squared off against Rowdy Piper and Paul Orndorff. But obviously in their corner, in Hulk Hogan's corner, you had Jimmy Superfly Snuka. In Rowdy Piper's corner, you had Cowboy Bob Orton. That's one of the promotional images from WrestleMania 1. Vince McMahon put all his money into this. He didn't know if it'd be a hit or a miss. The WWF back then could have went under like a Titanic sunk, but it didn't. The WWF thrived, and till this day it's still the #1 wrestling promotion on the planet. No matter what wrestling promotions comes, the WWE, which is known now, will ever be the #1 promotion. There won't be no other promotion. All those other promotions might as well just give up and get out of the water, because they're sharks and they'll come and get you. But I'm not biased against any wrestling promotion. Obviously, two of the big wrestling stars of the 1980s was Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. But we'll be talking about the top wrestling stars of the 1980s coming up in the next segment. In this segment, we'll be talking about some of the greatest wrestling personalities of the 1980s. You can't get any bigger than the greatest wrestling personalities than Vince McMahon. Obviously, my thoughts on Vince McMahon exceed other thoughts about other wrestling personalities. You got Vince McMahon, but you can't have Vince McMahon in the 1980s without the great Hulk Hogan. If it wasn't for Hulk Hogan, wrestling wouldn't have reached its peak in the 1980s if it wasn't for Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan starred in films, TV series, even had his own cartoon during the 1980s called Rock and Wrestling. That's right, all these WWF stars, some of them of the 1980s, the Rock and Wrestling era. You had the likes of Cyndi Lauper, Liberace, Mr. T. Who can forget Mr. T of A-Team fame, eh? Where Hulk Hogan appeared in a couple of episodes in season 4 of the A-Team. Then you got Hulk Hogan. How can you have Hulk Hogan without Macho Man Randy Savage and the First Lady of Wrestling, Miss Elizabeth? They had some great matches during the 1980s. They was enemies. Then they partnered up to be the Mega Powers, where the highlight match was happened in SummerSlam 1988 when they faced the Mega Bucks of Ted DiBiase and Andre the Giant. Special referee was Jesse the Body Ventura. That's right, he was also a wrestler who did part-time acting. Then we have Ric Flair. Yes, he did work for Rock Rival Promotions, NWA and that, and obviously WCW. Then we go on to the voice, in my opinion, the voice of the 1980s wrestling, Mr. Gorilla Monsoon. Obviously, he was the greatest commentator of the 1980s, but before that, he was a wrestler himself during the 60s and 70s. But when you talk about Gorilla Monsoon, you've got to have his broadcast partner, Bobby the Brain Heenan. Not only was Bobby the Brain Heenan one of the greatest commentators in the 1980s, he also had one of the greatest factions, the Heenan family. Consisted of Ravishing Rick Rude, Bobby Heenan, Andre the Giant, you had Haku, you had all of them that was in Heenan family. You also had some of the other greatest managers. Jimmy Math of the South Harp, you had Slick, you had the Grand Wizard, you had Captain Lou Albano, you had Classy Freddie Blassie, you know, the Pencil Neck Geeks. You had, that's what I'm saying, you had JJ Dillon, you had the wrestling managers, they made the wrestlers. Back then, the managers was a speaking point. You'd have them at ringside, and some of the stuff they come up with was monumental. Talk about the Mega Powers, as I did. This is some of the great tag teams. Obviously, I'll be listing a list of the great tag teams also soon. You had the Mega Powers. You can't forget the Rockers, eh? Shawn Michaels, Mighty Janee. But we all know where Shawn Michaels has ended up, don't we? Obviously, we've got two words for you. You can't talk about great tag team wrestling without talking about the Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal. They started off in the territories before coming to the WWF in the late 90s or early 90s, and they kept switching between promotions. You had the Great Hart Foundation. With their manager during the 90s was Jimmy Math of the South Hart, who also managed the Rougeau brothers. But to me, the Hart Foundation's biggest rivals of the 1980s was obviously the British Bulldogs, the decisive technical of the Dynamite Kid. Then you had his partner, also cousin. Yes, you didn't know that, did you? Cousin, Davey Boy Smith. When they was often coming to the ring with Matilda, but later on when Davey Boy went solo, he had Winston. But then, you could talk about tag team wrestling. You also had the factions of the 1990s. You had you've talked about Ric Flair. You've got the Four Horsemen, Ollie, Arn, Tally. Later on, you had Barry Windham. You also had JJ Dillon in the Four Horsemen. But in my opinion, to me, some of the best tag teams was involved with the WWF. The Powers of Pain, the Bushwhackers, you had the Fabulous Rougeau brothers, the Rockers, Can-Am Connection, Strike Force. You had obviously they wasn't named this till later on, but they used to team up. You had Greg Valentine and Honky Tonk Man, Rhythm and Blues, but it wasn't given that moniker until the early 90s, but this is the 80s, so we'll leave that to another time. But in my opinion, the greatest ever tag team ever was the longest reigning tag team champions in the WWF. Was Axe and Smash Demolition. Yes, Demolition started off with a different smash. But then he had to go somewhere else. So they brought in Barry Darsow, obviously, the real, well, not the real smash, but he smashed. Then they got a manager who can forget one of the greatest managers, Mr. Fuji. Exactly, Mr. Fuji, Demolition, and sided with Powers of Pain, which in turn turned Demolition baby faces. Coming up next, did you know? Some of the films during the 1980s starred the wrestling superstars. We all know some of the stars that starred in the films was Roddy Piper, Hulk Hogan. So here we're looking at some of the films. I'll be upping after this segment most of the wrestling films. You got Princess Bride with Andre the Giant. You got Running Man with Jesse Ventura. You got Predator with Jesse Ventura. You've got Hell Comes to Frogtown with Roddy Piper. The Highlander. You've got so many. I love them, so you can have a look yourself. But here's a few examples, as we see here. Obviously, with Roddy Piper, we've got the brilliant John Carpenter's Bailiff, starring Roddy Piper, Meg Foster. But here's a little known fact. In this film, they, underneath the bunkers, the guards are using, ready for this? PKE meters. That's right, the PKE meters from Ghostbusters. They're using it in this film. Then it follows up with Hulk Hogan and No Holds Barred. This one was the first film produced by the WWF. It was Hulk Hogan's first movie. Well, first movie for the WWF, but second movie outright. It was him and Zeus. Obviously, WWF promoted it because you had Zeus come to the Federation to attack Hulk Hogan during SummerSlam '89, Survivor Series '89. Then you had the special cage match between Zeus and Hulk Hogan, Brutus Barber Beefcake, and Macho Man. Then, that's right, that's the first movie Hulk Hogan starred in. The great Rocky series, Rocky III, which also starred Mr. T of 18 fame, but this was before the 18. The 18 was produced off the back of Mr. T. Then you had another wrestling film, Body Slam, with Roddy Piper, The Barbarian, you had the Tonga Kid, so many other wrestlers. Fantastic film, doesn't get enough credit, stars Dirk Benedict. What? Yes, Dirk Benedict. Obviously, the 18 fame. The 18 was so popular in the 1980s, so they got Dirk Benedict to star in a wrestling movie. Who knows it was to do with rock and wrestling? But that'd be funny. You had Mr. T with Hulk Hogan, Dirk Benedict with Roddy Piper. But what's me though? You got the 18. Ta-da! This is a still from an episode when Hulk Hogan starred in a season 4 of the 18. Welcome to Did You Know? The Did You Know this week is the famous wrestler known as Jake the Snake Roberts, famous for obviously East Snakes, reptilians, yeah, Damien, Lucifer, but in real life he was terrified of them. Yes, Jake the Snake Roberts, synonymous with snakes, was afraid of them. Well, that's Did You Know? Coming up, tour review, the WWF LJNs. Welcome to the tour review part. Like I said, this week, the tour review part is to do with WWF LJNs. This was the first WWF figures which were released back in the 80s by the company LJN. We all know LJN was a big toy company in the 1980s. They did other certain toy franchises, like, just to name a couple, Silverhawks, and obviously Thundercats. Let's get into the toy review. This is my own personal collection of WWF LJNs. I haven't touched them up, I haven't to make them look better, I bought these many years ago in the condition they are, because to me it shows play wear. So let's get to it. In the 1980s, obviously you had your good guys and bad guys, your heels, your faces. So let's start. Start from the back here. We've got the incomparable Flamboyant. All these figures were made of like pliable but hard rubber. Obviously we've got Jesse the Body Ventura. Then we've got the Iron Sheik. Obviously the Iron Sheik was WWF champion back in the early 80s, and he lost it to Hulk Hogan. Then we had his manager. Who can forget? Classy Freddie Blassie, you pencil neck geeks. Alright. Then who else we got? We got Nikolai Volkov, who was also managed by Classy Freddie Blassie. He was also a tag team partner with the Iron Sheik. Later on, he went to tag team up in the 80s with Boris Zukov, and they called themselves the Bolsheviks. Then we've got the Hot Scut, Rowdy Piper, who headlined the first WrestleMania with Hulk Hogan, Mr. T, Paul Orndorff. Then we've got, talking about him, it's only Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff himself. Yes, Red Rowdy Piper's tag team partner. Then we have here one of the biggest wrestlers, obviously, in size and shading, Big John Studd. Followed that up by, he started off as a heel, then he became a face, like I said in the Did You Know segment. It's Jake the Snake Roberts. Trust me. Then obviously we've got a couple of managers. Who can forget? Mr. Fuji. Followed by, in my opinion, the greatest manager of all time, Bobby the Brain Heenan. When he started his career back in the 1980s, he entered, obviously, as a heel. And we're talking about the Macho Man, Randy Savage. What this means with Randy Savage, all the managers fired to represent him. And they weren't good enough. Instead, he got the first ever lady manager, Miss Elizabeth. Obviously, as time went by, Macho Man and Miss Elizabeth, he was heel. One of the greatest wrestling matches in the 1980s was Macho Man versus Ricky Steamboat, WrestleMania 3. Then obviously, he became a face, teamed up with Hulk Hogan. Then he turned on Hulk Hogan because Hulk Hogan was showing some friendship towards Elizabeth. Macho Man thought it was different. That's what turned it, and that's when the Mega Powers exploded. Then we have one of the top tag teams of the 1980s. I told you, they started as heels, and you can't have the Hart Foundation, can you? Like I said, you can't have the Hart Foundation in the 1980s with their manager, Jimmy Mapp at the South Hart. But in during the 1980s, the Hart Foundation's biggest opponents and rivals, we all know, was obviously Davey Boy Smith, the Dynamite Kid, one of the greatest tag teams, if not the greatest British tag teams in the world, the British Bulldogs. But obviously, they were managed in the 1980s by Captain Lou Albano. Yay! Which we all know, Captain Lou was a heel, then become a face, and he was one of the major parts of Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling. Talk about Hulk Hogan. Here we have Hulk Hogan in his red and yellow. Then you've got the other version of Hulk Hogan in red and white. Then you got, some of you probably don't remember him, some of you probably do, Corporal Kirchner. Then you had a jobber. We all know what jobbers are. Ted Arcady. Then you had SD Jones, Special Delivery Jones. Then you got one half of the Killer Bees. This is B. Brian Blair. His tag team partner was Jumping Jim Brunzell, which I haven't got obviously. Then you got the Birdman himself, Coco Beware, with his famous parrot, Frankie! Bird, 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 baby, bird, bird, bird. Then you got, obviously, it wasn't probably in the 1980s, but it was during the 60s and 70s. The longest reigning WWF champion, yes, Bruno Sammartino. Earlier I said about Macho Man and his opponent, WrestleMania 3, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Here he is, in rubber form. LJN, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Back then, he was only called Ricky Steamboat. Then obviously we've got Arriba! Tito Santana, who went on, he was a fantastic Intercontinental Champion. Then he went on to team with Rick Martel, known as Strikeforce, and they became WWF Tag Team Champions before Rick Martel turned on him at WrestleMania 5. Then we have the face of the 1980s, the incomparable, the big, Andre the Giant, who went on to appear in many, many attractions and main events, especially at the world famous Madison Square Garden, the home of sports entertainment. Then we have Georgie Animal Steel, who was in a feud with Macho Man because he had affection for Elizabeth. Then you have Hillbilly Jim. Don't go mess with a country boy, country boy, country boy. Hillbilly Jim. And then in his first action figure, we have Vince McMahon, the owner of the WWF/WWE. And here he is in his first ever action figure, but back then, he was known for his commentating. Coming up next, it's the fun fact. Fun fact time. The incomparable, the fantastic interviewer we all know as Mean Gene Okerlund. Alright, here comes fun fact. He's undefeated. Yeah, every time he's wrestled, he never lost. 4 times he wrestled and 4 times he won. Anyway, that's the fun fact. I just want to say congratulations to this week's competition winner, Derek Whiteside, who has won these 2 1989 sealed Batman trading cards. But please, Derek, do not eat the bubblegum. I'll be whisking these off straight to you ASAP. Thank you for watching this week's show. Coming up next week, we'll be looking at the TV shows in the 1980s. See you there.